The Blue Jewel.
Chapter 6. Completed. At that time, bandits ruled the Deadlands. They wreaked a lot of havoc on whomever they intended to use. The Southern Road. After a meticulous ploy planned by the Dragon Ridge Coalition, it was possible to recover the security that the road required. Chronicles of the Dragon's Ridge. Volume XXI. Asia Ilamunin. The crossing was pleasant and brief. At this time of year sailing through the Strait of the Sea of Ice was quite placid, nothing to do with the sea conditions during the winter. After 5 days' journey, they reached the port of Essamania, the capital of the Kingdom of Syria, north of the Dragon's Ridge mountain range. From here the rest of the journey would be by land using heavy wagons until they reached their destination, the Kingdom of Domemba. Arian observed from the deck of the ship the profile of the city of Essamania. It was noticeable that this city was very different from tame, simpler and poorer constructions. The port was much smaller than that of the capital of the Kingdom of Bir, and despite Essamania being a capital of a very important kingdom, compared to Tame, it now seemed like a simple village to her. Arian now felt more confident in herself. She was already out of the realm of Bir and away from the mags of the Order of the White Robes. They remained in that city for 2 weeks, while the ships arrived loaded with the iron purchased at Bir and the iron was placed in the wagons. The young woman was curious about the specific location of Domemba and the caravan's travel plan, so Agnorak showed her some maps that Gosberg had saved. Arian discovered that Domemba was located in the south of the continent. To the north of the kingdom lay the great chain of Dragon Ridge Mountains, which ran across Darsuk from northwest to southwest. The most traveled route was the coastal road, but the king planned to use another route, little traveled, the southern road, that ran west of the Dragon Ridge mountain range and next to the Desert of Lower, or of the Deadlands, an extensive unexplored territory, where it was said only the law of the strongest prevailed. They were to follow this route south until they reached the lower pass, where the road crossed the great mountain range, and then headed east to Domemba. It was a very risky and unknown path. Previous attempts had failed, but the king had decided on this path because the other way involved passing through the great kingdom of Albiona. All the other kingdoms were without a nearby supply of iron, and that was the reason for the king's long and complicated journey, to obtain iron and find a safe new route to stock up on that precious mineral. The preparations for the huge caravan to Domemba were enormous. The king was screaming orders all day long. Even Gosberg seemed to be very immersed in such a complicated task of quartermaster. In spite of all the difficulties, after 3 weeks' stay in Essamania the huge caravan finally set out, more than 200 wagons taking part in this enormous adventure.
Arian traveled with Vanis in one of the wagons at the back of the caravan, where the journey was smoother and more bearable. The caravan kicked up a great deal of dust. They advanced slowly but at a steady pace, and after 2 days the sea was no longer present on the horizon. They left it to the north. It took the young woman a while to get used to the absence of the sea again. Arian had grown up with him always by his side, but the thought of seeing his brother again made up for the monotony of this journey. The days passed in a similar way, getting up at dawn and then setting off. In the middle of the afternoon they would stop for the horses and mules to rest and eat something. After this short rest they again moved forward until the sun went down. They stopped and set up camp, after which they had dinner, and immediately went to bed, since they had to get up early the next day. The mood in the caravan, however, was relaxed, although as the trip progressed there began to be some tension in the atmosphere. Arian had a sneaking suspicion that everyone in the caravan was waiting for something to happen, and although no one was talking about it, it was more than obvious to Arian. Nor did the scenery make the journey more pleasant. To his left was the huge mountain range of the Dragon's Ridge with its huge black mountains, with its peaks covered with eternal snows, below which was the kingdom of the dwarves. The mountains seemed to have no end and disappeared into the horizon. To his right was a vast expanse, flat and empty to infinity, the so-called Deadlands, a desert where only death and despair could fit. That monotonous sight made the journey that much harder. Days passed and on the horizon to his right began to be seen some elevations in the desert. Tahir, the veteran soldier driving his wagon, told him that it was the Brown Hills. Legend had it that those hills were once a temple of the elves. The elves came to inhabit these lands, and the path they now followed was the ancient southern road that linked the northern kingdom with the southern kingdom, and they were connected through the great bridge of Tame. Arion thought again of the elves, of the magical kingdom of the elves that was located in the north of Caesarea, and he felt a pain in his chest, a pain he never thought he would have, a pain produced by his love for that small fishing village. The next day they received word that the king seemed somewhat indisposed by the journey, so Vanus left his company in the wagon to see what was causing his majesty uneasiness. Arion was left alone with the driver of the wagon, who took the last place in the caravan to take the trip more calmly. The only company she had was Agnarok, who sometimes climbed up next to her to talk to her for a while. Gosberg was very busy. He had to arrange the safety of the trip, something complicated by the large number of wagons. They arrived at a crucial point in the journey, the lower pass, where the Brown Hills and the Dragon's Ridge came almost to join at that point. Only a small plain of 100 meters separated the two geographical features. As the caravan passed between the two elevations, the young woman came up with a slightly malicious idea. "It's a perfect place for an ambush," Arion smiled. Lately she was becoming somewhat paranoid. But nothing could be further from the truth. There was a great tension in the atmosphere. I didn't know when, but soon something would happen. Then she heard a noise. It was like a dry whistle that pierced the air, and then an impact, then a cry of pain, came from a soldier who was escorting the caravan a few meters in front of her. Immediately the wagon stopped and silence reigned in the place. Another soldier approached the wounded man and saw that it was indeed an arrow. There was no time for more. From both sides of the road, attackers came out brandishing their swords and shooting arrows at the wagons. They were bandits. The soldiers who guarded the caravan came out to meet them. The wagons tried to make a circle to defend themselves from the attack. But given the sheer number of wagons and their heavy load, making such a move quickly was tricky. Arion's wagon, being the last one, was in a very complicated situation. The assailants were quickly approaching them. She saw them brandishing their weapons and with their clothes completely white, fruit of the clay dust of the desert. The driver tried to get off the road looking for the slopes of the mountains to free himself from the harassment. Unfortunately, an arrow mortally wounded him in the neck. The wagon was left without a driver and caused the horses to lose control. The vehicle turned completely and advanced with great speed towards the attackers dressing them. The bandits had to jump to avoid being run over. The wagon was out of control. It was heading quickly towards the Brown Hills. Arion could not stop it although he got hold of the bridle, but the horses were rearing. Taming them was impossible. The pack animals turned to avoid a large stone. The wagon skidded, lost stability and ended up overturning, turning twice over. Arion was ejected, crashing to the ground and knocking herself unconscious. Gosberg and Agnarok carried out the orders received by Debok as soon as they arrived in Asimia. The plan was simple: escort the caravan and wait for the attack at the lower pass. The company had spies who confirmed that attack with complete certainty. They spoke to His Majesty and he agreed to carry out the mercenaries' reckless plan. To make the southern road a safe route he had to risk his life. Agnarok was worried that Arion would take the last places in the caravan, but despite his attempts, he could do nothing. The driver of that wagon insisted on being one of the last, which gave him headaches. He spoke to Gosberg about the matter, but the order was clear: no one was to know anything about the plan drawn up by Debok. There were many spies from Olbianor and any mistake could cause the operation to fail, and a lot of gold and his reputation were at stake. So when the attack began everything was chaos. The truth is that even if we expected things did not go as they had predicted, neither the wagons reacted quickly, nor did the king's soldiers act forcefully. They soon found themselves under attack by bandits who were too organized and trained to be mere fortune seekers. The half-orc was deep in the fight, but he could see Arion's wagon lose control and venture into the Brown Hills. Their intention was to follow him, but then the sign appeared that they were waiting in the sky. A large ball of fire streaked through the air, hitting the front of the bandits. At the signal, the expected reinforcements arrived. More than 200 mercenaries from the Blue Phoenix Company came to his aid, all of their members available.
Agnarok, go with that platoon and cover the southern flank, Kush ordered. The half-orc thought about not obeying the order, but there was little he could do. Kush, a wagon has left for the Black Hills, we have to go help its occupants. The magician turned his head and surveyed the hills. Okay, take your place. I'm going to warn Aris. It was the only thing the half-orc could do, and he and his dozen companions headed for the southern flank with sword in hand. When Arion opened his eyes he had a big headache and felt like he was bleeding from his head. It must have been a pretty big wound. The young woman was leaning against what was left of the wagon. Someone had rescued her since she had fallen quite far from there. With a great effort, he tried to see who was standing in front of him smiling. Arion was frightened, and there in front of him were 4 bandits, completely covered with desert dust, armed with swords and bows, dressed in tattered clothes. They looked at her greedily and her smile was disgusting. It was not difficult to find out her intentions and that her situation was desperate. There were 3 men and an orc, huge and terrifying, with big pointed ears. He showed large sharp yellow teeth, which was smiling evilly. His skin was dark green and full of tattoos and scars. In his right hand he carried a large short sword. Comrades, I already told you that this work would give us great rewards. Hearing these words from one of the members of the group, the others smiled lasciviously. Arion tried to move to escape, but he couldn't. A very sharp pain in his side prevented him from doing so. He must have at least 1 or 2 broken ribs. She had to be thankful that she was alive, though in the hands of these bandits it was almost better to die in the accident. The bandits slowly approached her, knowing that she was very vulnerable at the moment and could not defend herself. The first one will be me, that's why I discovered her. One of them commented with satisfaction. Arion looked away. It was disgusting. We shouldn't leave it for after the battle. We've been in this desert for 3 filthy months, the battle can wait. The bandit crouched down, threw his weapons to the ground, and both arms reached out to touch Arion's breasts. She lowered her head in resignation. The rest of the group was smiling with pleasure. He didn't touch them, his hands stopped in his tracks. The bandit tried to scream but only made a dull sound. Arion looked up, the bandit dying over her, trying to pull out an arrow that had pierced her throat. Blood poured down on Arion. Another arrow, accurate, hit the head. The target fell like a dead weight on the young woman. The other 3 bandits watched in surprise as their leader lay dead. Arion felt the weight of the bandit imprison her and the stammering movement of his agonizing limbs. She tried to move her head but her range of vision was very limited. The bandits took cover with the wagon and tried to discover their mysterious attacker, but it was impossible for them. They seemed to be alone among the abundant rocks that crowded at the beginning of the slopes of the desolate brown hills. In the distance you could hear the screams, explosions and clashes of swords from the attack on the caravans. The orc did not have patience as one of his virtues. He ran up to Arion's height, grabbed her by the head and lifted her up. Arion noticed how he dug his nails into his head. The pain in his abdomen didn't let him breathe. He also noticed how the edge of a knife touched the skin of his neck. The orc stared into the void and shouted in his hoarse voice. Listen, damn. If you don't come out of hiding, the girl will die right here. The blade squeezed Arion's neck a little and a little blood gushed out. Then from a rock much closer than everyone thought, barely 4 meters from the wagon, a figure appeared that released a short wooden bow and advanced to the bandits slowly. The orc smiled and let go of Arion, who fell to the ground like a sack of onions. The stranger wore the same uniform as Gosberg and Agnorok, but his face was covered by a blue scarf. His black hair was swayed by the soft warm desert breeze. His black eyes looked at his adversaries in a cold, calculating way. He had an air of Agnorok but was shorter and less corpulent, that is, his gait was much more elegant. The stranger reached the height of the bandits, drew a sword he had, and got into an attack position. The 3 bandits stood parallel and advanced to face him, the orc in the central position and the 2 humans on the flanks. These were the ones who attacked without saying a word. Arion could now see the scene, all that his blurred vision left him. The attack of the first bandit, the one on the left flank, was quickly dodged by his rival by means of a ribbon to his attempt to thrust the heart. The stranger launched a quick counterattack, thrust to the side with the edge going upwards. The blow sought the heart and found it. Now the first bandit lay on the ground. The other one on the right did not hesitate and attacked again. The unknown blocked this attack with his sword. With his right leg he made a direct sweep to the right knee of the bandit. He fell to the ground. He was easy prey, decapitated without being able to defend himself. The stranger was deadly, swift as Gosberg had shown in Ziri's alley. The orc froze, staring at the corpses of his companions who had not had the slightest chance against the stranger. "I know you," the orc exclaimed as he brandished his short sword. The stranger took off his handkerchief and showed his young face with a smile, and spoke in a deep voice. "Arasath Arakanaras." The orc opened his eyes and bowed. After he sat up, Arian felt as if the orc regained his dignity. It was a strange feeling. "My lord, I'm sorry, but I must try to kill you," the orc managed to say with a strange sense of pride and resignation. The orc did something strange. In his left hand he removed a leather wristband with his teeth, then with his sword he made a cut on his wrist quite deeply, sucked a large amount of blood, and then spat it on the ground. "Decast." The orc showed a smile, his mouth full of his own blood as he said those words. The stranger performed the same ceremony as the orc, and when he had finished, he also said, "Decast." Both of them remained in silence watching each other, until the orc decided to attack his opponent with a huge scream. His opponent remained still waiting for him with apparent tranquility. The orc attacked frontally brandishing his sword with his two hands. It was a beastly blow. He performed it with all the strength of his powerful physique. He could break a thick rennet tree, however the stranger dodged it with a simple movement of his trunk to his left. It was a slight and elegant gesture. The orc was surprised to see that his brutal thrust was only in the air, and when he missed his punch, he became unbalanced, falling to the ground heavily. A deadly mistake that the stranger took advantage of now that his opponent had his back to him. He quickly turned and attacked with his sword quickly, a thrust from the back straight to the heart. It was graceful, fast, and deadly. The orc sighed, before vomiting blood and then dying. Once the threat of the bandits was over, the stranger approached Arian who lay unconscious. In the distance reinforcements arrived with a wagon. He put the handkerchief back on and lifted it up to safety. Both stayed in that place waiting for the help that the young woman needed to arrive. Hazy memories, screams, cries, everything was shrouded in a too strange black cloud. When Arian regained consciousness, he immediately regretted doing so. He began to suffer from a headache so intense that it did not allow him to think. It seemed that his head was about to explode. It hurt so much that to relieve it she had to close her eyes. But it was useless. The pain was such that it prevented him from falling asleep again. Arian uttered a faint groan in complaint, and a figure rose from the back of the room to examine it. The figure rested its hand on Arian's head for a moment. The hand had a pleasant touch. The figure mumbled something in a whisper that seemed to him to have a tone of concern. "Vanus, come here immediately," shouted the figure, just after whispering a few more sentences that Arian did not understand. The shadow had a deep voice and a strange accent. It was a male voice. Presently the Kendali appeared, in her usual purple robe, and hurried to where the young woman lay lain. "What's the matter, my lord?" The man looked at Vanus with a serious expression. They spoke in a low tone, but Arian could hear perfectly what they were talking about. "Arian has finally woken up. I think he is in terrible pain, so take these herbs and prepare an infusion that he must drink every 4 hours." Vanus left the room to do the man's bidding, and again silence reigned in the place. Arian, in spite of his limited physical condition, tried to speak, but only a faint murmur came from it, with which he addressed the figure that stood in the gloom that reigned in that place. "Who are you?" Arian asked. The figure didn't answer, just sat up again and gently caressed Arian's face. She noticed that it was a man's hands, but his touch was soft. It reminded her of her brother's hands or loafs, so soft, so harmonious. That man must be a wizard, thought the young woman. "Are you a magician?" The figure caressed Arian's forehead affectionately again. "Don't worry, little one, we will have time for the introductions. Now rest and have the drink that Vanus offers you." And the figure returned to its lookout spot at the back of the room. Arion tried to sleep as advised by the mysterious figure, but it was unsuccessful. After a while the Kendali returned with a cup in her hand from which steam was coming out. The Kendali was quickly offered to Arion. He just had to open his mouth, but it still took him a terrible effort to swallow the infusion, but in the end he succeeded. Thanks to the concoction prepared by the Kendali, he felt much better and the stabbing pain almost disappeared, so he was finally able to sleep in a restful way. The days passed slowly, Arion evolving until he felt much better. So much so that Kush decided to resume the march. Kush was another member of the mercenary company in the service of the king of Domemba, as was the young man who had saved his life from the bandits. Everything that happened was the result of a risky stratagem. They knew that the bandits would not resist attacking a caravan in which the king of Domemba was traveling. So they decided to ambush the bandits to finish them off once and for all and secure the southern road. What the mercenaries didn't count on was that the plan initially went so wrong and that Arion's wagon ended up destroyed in the Brown Hills. So it had to be Aras himself, who commanded all the mercenaries, who rescued her from those evil bandits. Everyone feared the worst, and given its condition it was decided not to move it and decided to set up a small camp in that place. Kush, Vanus and Agnorak and 7 other mercenaries remained. They must have had no problems as all the bandits were eliminated and the area was now safe, while the caravan continued its course south. 2 weeks had passed since the battle and Arion's recovery was a success, but although he was able to travel, he still felt some after-effects of that tragic accident. Despite their diminished condition, Kush decided to resume the march, before they decided to say goodbye to those who fell in the battle with the bandits and whose remains would rest forever in that desolate place. Kush led the group. He had the rank of captain within the mercenary company. Kush was a mage, with fine features, dark skin, brown eyes, a round skull, a thin goatee that snaked over his delicate lips. Yet he had a privileged physique, a height that rivaled Agnorak, and broad shoulders gave packaging to a maid's robe of the same light blue color as his comrades in arms. His deep, calm and serene voice, coupled with a strange accent that gave him an exotic tone when he spoke. All the other members of the group respected him, and no one disputed his orders. Even the half-orc looked comfortable under his command. The magician's gaze was reflective, but in the background there was a gleam that indicated that if the situation needed it, he could unleash the fury of a dragon. The group was small, only a dozen. Arion and Vanus were the travelers of a small wagon driven by the magician himself. She was also accompanied by Kiona. The mule had never left them since Gosberg used it many times as a mount during the journey with the caravan. Now she carried part of the mercenaries' equipment. After a week the landscape softened. Everything began to turn a little greener, some grasses growing among the rocks. It was the sign that they were approaching the pass of Lower and that they would finally leave the Deadlands behind. In the evening they set up camp under the structure of the old wagon, setting up a sort of tent and making a comforting fire at which all gathered except those who were on guard and enjoyed the Kendali's talent in the kitchen. "Is Lower's Pass far away?" Arion asked while enjoying a delicious soup made by Vanus, who, despite having hardly any raw materials, was able to surprise them with delicious dishes. "No, we'll get there in 2 days." The magician replied as he glanced through a heavy book that always accompanied him every night. "I've seen a map of Gosberg. It's always drawn with walls, but isn't it a gorge?" The magician had to look up, closed the book, lit a pipe that he used to enjoy just before going to sleep, pondered what answer to give the young woman. Yes, it was a simple gorge, until the elves built a fortress that completely occupied it. Elves? Were there elves here? The elves always excited the young girl. Kush smiled as he saw the reaction to her words. "This road we used is the old southern road. It linked the northern kingdom with the southern kingdom. Through a bridge that crossed the Strait of the Sea of Ice, of which only the wall that protects the city of Tame remains." Kush was surprised. He didn't expect Arion to have knowledge of ancient history, since almost no one cared about the ancient elven kingdoms of the First and Second eras. Yes, one of the best preserved remnants of the ancient power of the elves, perhaps next to Loess Pass. They both fell silent, Arian's thoughts turning to the elves, the first children of the gods, and that they were now isolated from the world and with less and less power. Perhaps they were destined to disappear. How do you know that Thames Wall was part of the Great Bridge of the Elves? Kush asked the young woman strangely. Gosberg told me about it when I arrived in Thame. Gosberg? Are you colleagues? Kush smiled and then slowly smoked the tobacco from his pipe. Indeed, he already belonged to the company before I joined. The best mercenary company in all of Shanaris. The magician smiled again. Gosberg was certainly not modest. You are right, we are all in the service of the king of Domemba right now. Who rescued me from bandits? Aris, he is the one who commands this battalion of mercenaries. If it's very young. Arian exclaimed, the boy must be his age at most. Maturity for a half-orc is different than for men. Another half-orc. The second half-orc I knew, even though they said it wasn't a common mix. Yes, we have 2 half-orcs within the company, which is truly extraordinary. Don't be fooled by Aris' youthful looks, he's an experienced and magnificent warrior. Arian was excited, but Kush didn't seem up for the task of continuing the conversation any longer. Is it better than Gosberg? Kush smiled again, extinguished his pipe and withdrew the tobacco from it over the palm of his hand, got up and threw the contents over the fire, to Arian's surprise. The rest of the tobacco, when touched by the flames, transformed into a kind of light bubbles of many colors that exploded, leaving a smell of roses. No one can be better than Gosberg. The magician replied frankly. Arian fell asleep to the smell of roses, while Kush went to check that everything was going well in the camp. Agnorak listened to the conversation from a distance, and indeed Aris was a half-orc like himself. And he was barely over 20 years old and already knew fame and glory, while if he was known somewhere, it was because he owed food. Aris was the son of the great orc general Arabicaras, king of the Sinafti, the White Orcs. Rakraklas was the first orc to serve on the Imperial Council. Under the command of Arabicaras, the Black Kingdom's legions conquered the mighty elven kingdom of Tort Anal, bringing the entire continent of Degassi to the Black Empire's ultimate domination. A great victory that made Arabicaras himself one of the favorite candidates to occupy the imperial throne. In the Black Kingdom, when the emperor died or abdicated, his successor was chosen from among one of the members of the Imperial Council, although many times it was a direct descendant or a relative of the emperor skillfully placed in the Imperial Council, but it did not always happen. On this occasion there was no clear successor from the emperor's direct family. For which Arabicaras was the great favorite, he would be the first orc emperor, a fact that aroused great suspicion in the imperial court. There were already many problems when 30 years earlier Emperor Yonosa II granted full citizenship to the orc tribes of the south, with many orcs joining the imperial legions, as in the case of Arabicaras. This decision caused much friction among the more traditional nobility of the Black Empire, but the results were unquestionable. The imperial legions were transformed into a war-winning machine. Agnorak's father, named Agnok, was a Sinafti like Arabicaras, so stories about his king had always interested Agnorak. Arabicaras had a son Aris, who was an excellent warrior and was appointed general when he was only 16 years old, and although he was a half-orc and at that age he was considered an adult, but it was still an extraordinary fact. The truth is that the father and son duo did not know defeat. At the death of Emperor Jasona II, who was also one of the main supporters of Arabicaras, preparations began for the election of a new emperor who only had 2 clear candidates, Arabicaras and a human nobleman Reginald de Bruin, Duke of Antivia, cousin of the former emperor. The vote had to be postponed as Arabicaras had to mobilize his legions in the face of an attack by the elves on the Black Empire's overseas possessions. There was no choice, the elven offensive was forceful, more than expected. After a month of campaigning he found the orc general who had no reinforcements and were isolated from the empire by sea. Then the misfortune happened. They called it the Massacre of the Ahomka Plateau. The elves mobilized together with their human allies one of the most powerful armies that had ever been seen and surrounded the troops of Arabicaras. The battle lasted 2 days, and at its denouement the legions of the Black Empire were massacred and their great general Arabicaras died guarding his standard. Only Aras and a dozen white orcs survived. The head of the great general was given to the great elven king of Borderlania as the spoils of a great victory and revenge for the fall of Tortanel. Defeat could be regarded as a war attempt, a miscalculation. But the scandal erupted when Aras appeared before the Imperial Council with an accusation against the other candidate for the throne. Reginald Deberin had conspired with the elves to kill his father. But Aras had arrived late. Reginald had already been made emperor. As soon as news of Arakabara's death arrived, the council voted in favor of Deberin. Aras almost killed the newly appointed emperor with his own hands. His fame and heroic deeds saved his life, but he was punished with banishment and the loss of his dynastic rights to the throne of the White Orcs. Although there was no evidence to justify Aras' accusation, the truth is that since then the reign of Emperor Deberin was under suspicion and the Orcs do not have much sympathy for him. Since he was one of those who opposed their assimilation into the Empire, rumors of Orc revolts in the south are growing despite Deberin's attempt to control them. Meanwhile, Aras became a stateless mercenary, and Debok was quick to offer him a position among his ranks, which Aras gladly accepted. Aras was very famous. He was called the Black General. Agnorok, who lived thousands of miles, knew his history. For him it was clear that he was the true king of the White Orcs no matter how much the emperor took away his dynastic rights. The emperor was a man and had no competence in Orc affairs. Now the king was a cousin of Aras. Agnorok didn't even remember the name of that puppet, but he didn't even use the title of king out of shame. In a sense Agnorok was envious of Aras, the banished prince, who was destined to do great things, not like him. It was only natural that Arion would be so fascinated by the Black General. The next 2 days passed with a certain monotony, but on the horizon appeared among the mountains, a luminous spectacle, the Pass of Lower. Arion couldn't help but remember Tame and its wall in the middle of the sea. This fortress was undoubtedly the work of the elves. It was a plain white structure, with a simple entrance. Its height was considerable. It blended in with the slopes of the mountains of the Dragon's Ridge, since it was not possible to distinguish clearly which part was a mountain or a fortress, except for its large half-ruined battlements that appeared at different levels. They arrived at the lower pass the next day. No one said anything. Despite centuries of abandonment, it retained its spectacularity. Its absence of cracks was impressive, its smooth surface that shone in the sunlight. The entrance was completely unprotected. The doors had disappeared, submerged in the tide of time. The group entered slowly and silently as if they didn't want to break the magic of that magnificent place. They made their way through a narrow corridor, which was in a comfortable gloom, and though they had spent only a little more than 5 minutes inside the place, it seemed like centuries to them. Arion looked at the inside of the fortress, the different levels. Everything was very beautiful but sad. They finally saw the way out. When they went outside, Arion felt that a weight was lifted from his shoulders, and he did not look back to say goodbye to the construction of the elves, much darker than that of Tame. That place must have a very sad history. Once they crossed the pass, the southern part of the Dragon's Ridge appeared before them. They were greeted by large green meadows, and left the desert behind. The green steppes and lush forests greeted the group. The journey was made more pleasant via the southern road. The old road seemed to be better preserved. There were still well-paved areas, and in less than a week's journey they would reach their destination, Domemba. They decided to camp in the shade of some oak trees for the night. Arion couldn't help but ask Kush about Loas Pass. I thought it was strange. I had a disconcerting feeling as I passed by. The young woman confessed to the magician. Strange? In what sense? Asked the bewildered magician. Yes, I felt sadness. That place was sad. It wasn't like the Tame Bridge. I felt pain, hatred. Kush smoked some of his pipe and closed his book again. Don't you know what happened at the lower pass? No, I don't know. The Tame Bridge is much older than the lower pass. It united, as I told you, the kingdom of the north with the kingdom of the south. In the pass of Lower a bloody war took place. War. If a war, the great war between the elves. It was the one that ended the age of the elves. The 8 great elven kingdoms fought against each other. In this place the kingdoms of the north and south fought bloody battles in the Deadlands. In the pass of Lower many elven warriors and their human allies died. Kush was silent, the wizard seeming absorbed in some thought. Arion had to talk to him again to bring him to his senses. Tell me one thing, Kush, in the end who won the war? Everyone lost. In the end the elven kingdoms ended up destroyed, and except for the Palace of Heaven, abandoned to their fate, the surviving elves sought shelters further away and better defended. Only ruins remained that were gradually occupied by men, or as in the case of the lower pass, abandoned forever. It was the end of an era. Only ruins remained. Too much power even for elves. Arion couldn't fall asleep, so he got up to walk around the small camp. Vanus always slept curled up. In the background there was always Agnorok doing the first shift of guard as usual, sitting on the ground with his back resting on a dry log. The half-orc, as he watched the sky, cleaned his sword conscientiously. The blue moon, Zoran, began to decline its reign before the white moon, Ilta. The nights began to become clearer and the animals were much more active. There are a lot of half-orcs by the looks of it. Agnorok turned his head and smiled slightly. An amazing coincidence. So many people say it that I begin to believe that this fact is not a coincidence. As far as I know, it is not a very common mixture, and in most cases they are not unwanted children. Was this your case? Agnorok was silent. He didn't have many memories of his mother, to be honest. She had died when he was very young. If my father didn't lie to me, no. I was wanted, but to be honest I only know the paternal version. My mother passed away when I was very young. I'm sorry, I understand you perfectly. My parents died when I was very young too. They spent some time in silence, watching the stars slowly appear through the lush forest. The air was pleasant and the noise of the forest was a much more pleasant melody than the silence of the desert. Arion, I grew up among men. I know the orc traditions from my father, but I'm more of a man than an orc, to be honest. Arion didn't add anything else. She fell asleep next to Agnorok. We all have a difficult life, the young woman thought. The journey passed with its usual monotony. Although it was now a more pleasant landscape for the young woman, the journey was becoming a little longer than she expected. Little by little, small peasant villages appeared until they reached a rather large city, the Shadow of the Dragon, the capital of the kingdom of the Forest of Fambir. Kingdom bordering Domemba. The city was built on the banks of a great river, one of the many that rose on this side of the Dragon's Ridge and that made this region so fertile. Kush decided to spend the night in the city, and for the first time in over a month Arion slept on the pleasant comfort of a bed and allowed himself the luxury of a hot bath. The southwestern area of the Dragon's Ridge was rich in small kingdoms, such as Sizia, Domemba, Yape, the kingdom of the 3 rivers, and many more. To the south was the great kingdom of Olbiana, where Tripulia was located, where she was secretly heading. Olbiana, the powerful kingdom of the south, was never a threat to Olbiana, but everything changed after the Iron Wars, where he annexed large territories in the north that were called the New Olbiana, which is why the small kingdoms that were located to the north, in the vicinity of the Dragon's Ridge, were so distrustful of Olbiana. They could be the next target of the Jewel of the South, as the capital of the kingdom of Olbiana was called. And this distrust increased after the agreement between the dwarfs and Olbiana for the exclusive sale of the dwarf's iron to Olbiana after the Iron Wars. The next day they left Shadow of the Dragon, not continuing south as was usual on the southern road. They continued west towards Domemba. The terrain became somewhat more arid, although it was always dotted with small rivers on which vegetation grew. At last they reached their destination. A small kingdom dotted with charming villages and white houses. The kingdom of Domemba was small and simple, but His Majesty lived in great luxury. Arion asked Kush. What is the reason for the king's wealth? Precious stones. Domemba has a subsoil rich in gems and diamonds, so abundant that the king is even the envy of the dwarfs. understand," replied the young woman astonished. "The king is so rich that he can buy everything he wants, that's why Albiona longs to conquer his kingdom, he wants Domemba's fortune. Why don't they attack? I mean, Albiona is a powerful kingdom and the king rules over a fairly small territory, why don't they conquer them?" The magician smiled slightly at Arian's question. "The king looks like a kind and capricious person because of his appearance. But he is a very skilled politician. First, he is allied with all the kingdoms in the area. They have formed a league, the League of the Dragon's Back. So if Albiona attacks Domemba, he will declare war on all the other kingdoms and is no longer such an insignificant rival. And then there's something else." "Which one?" "Gold. You don't need to recruit an army. You are so rich that you can buy the best mercenaries in the world. Albiona would not be facing a group of peasants, but well-trained and expert warriors, and that makes the Jewel of the South think very seriously about its possibilities before launching into the conquest of the rich kingdom of Domemba." Arian remained silent. So the mercenaries were here, the king paying very generously for their expensive services. After 2 days' journey, they arrived at the capital of the kingdom of Domemba, which had the same name as the kingdom. It could not be called a city exactly, it was exclusively His Majesty's palace. The idea of its construction was his, and only his servants, family and guests were allowed to enter. No inhabitant of Domemba could build in its surroundings but could go to the palace to attend an audience or pay tribute. The huge building was made of white granite, and once they passed the walls they saw that the affirmation, "The king's fortune," was enormous. The palace was full of fountains and gardens, gold abounded in every detail. It was a very pleasant place with wide avenues that all ended in the central part where the royal palace was, and with great towers that shone in the sky. They left the wagon and received them to Lasgama effusively. He was concerned about the state of Arian and led them directly into the presence of the king. In the audience hall they found His Majesty, who has always received the 2 young women with joy. "My dear, you're recovered," the king exclaimed as he embraced the young woman with great effusiveness, so much so that Arian could hardly speak. "Now we can celebrate the victory. Tonight there will be a dinner in your honor." Trumpet sounds, servants threw rose petals at the king and the young women, and everyone went crazy. A frenzied activity began to prepare the gala dinner. Meanwhile, Arian and Vanus were lodged in the apartments of the king's daughters, where they were treated with all the comforts and luxuries. The baths were huge and exquisitely decorated with scented water and fruity bath salts. Arian recovered from the trip though. She was reluctant to be helped to bathe. Vanus completely refused. If she bathed, it was something she would do alone. They were dressed in the finest garments. Arian wore a simple silk suit with blue gold thread and leather sandals with an exquisite finish. They perfumed her with an essence of spring roses. She had never seen anything like it in her life. For the Kendali, the king had a surprise, a custom-made tunic, a fabric a little lighter than hers, but that as always he totally hid her. Afterwards they were left alone in those rooms. The servants informed her that the feast would begin as was tradition in Domemba at sunset. From his bed, Arian could see through a huge window the palace, its enormous gardens and the different palaces that made it up. He observed the numerous fountains with large ponds where the birds drank and rested. It felt as if the king's palace was a piece of paradise. At sunset, the palace was plunged into darkness. The white moon dominated the night. Since its sister, the blue moon, today had to disappear. That indicated that summer was in full swing. Still, despite the fact that with the full white moon the clarity was much greater, the torches, lamps and candles were lit. Following a servant they advanced through the corridors and halls until they reached a huge courtyard full of guests. The open ceiling revealed the starry sky and was decorated with exotic flowers. They had been informed that it was customary in Domemba for guests to gather informally before the dinner itself, while eating and drinking the dishes served at a large central table richly decorated with flowers and statues. As soon as the king saw the 2 young women in the room, he gave them all his attention, hugged them again, and again Arian was breathless. "Beloved, you are most beautiful. I compliment them, but come in, eat and have fun, this is your home." The monarch pointed to where the food and drink were, a table in the center of the huge room that was filled with fruit, meat, hors d'oeuvres, and multiple drinks. Behind the king was Kush dressed in a white robe. It wasn't his wizard's robe. He looked much better and no longer sported a sloppy goatee and was more relaxed. But it was the king who was still talking to Arian and the Kendali. Dear ones, today we celebrate that our expedition has been a resounding success. We have reopened the southern road and I have plans to keep that route open permanently. 2 new guests, some ambassadors, arrived at the feast, and the king had to leave them to give them a formal greeting, so they were left alone with the magician. How was your stay in Domemba? Well, don't worry, it's a nice place. Arian replied that he had not traveled so much to be able to compare with such an experienced criterion as that of the magician. Yes, you can see the power generated by precious stones. Since His Highness's grandfather defeated the dwarfs, this kingdom does not stop growing in power and influence. Arian noticed that the party was too quiet. He noticed someone's absence. And Gosberg? Kush smiled again and pointed his eyes to the young woman to stand in a large group at the end of the courtyard. There was the Denkka chatting with a dwarf with short blonde hair and a rectangular goatee, not what Arian expected from a dwarf. Next to them and listening to the conversation between the Denkka and the dwarf was a huge orc with grey skin and huge fangs. He was scary, but no one seemed intimidated by his presence. A very heterogeneous group. If they are all members of our mercenary company. Arian looked at the magician in surprise. She expected a company of men only. Kush raised an eyebrow before speaking. Yes, maybe it's a bit strange. The dwarf's name is Kritus Blackrock and the orc's name is Mulak Utharakan. The young woman watched them carefully. She had grown up among men. Perhaps she had seen a dwarf who wanted to trade her wares or a dead snow troll. But now the sight of orcs and dwarfs rubbing shoulders with the cream of Domemba was strange to him. And he appeared. She greeted the other 3 mercenaries. He was not very tall, barely 6 feet tall. Arian immediately recognized him. He was the young man who had rescued her from the bandits in the Battle of the Deadlands. Her long black hair fell over her shoulders, her black eyes were vivid, she had neat and beautiful facial features. He was like a little brother of Agnorak. That's the one who saved me from the bandits. I point Arian to Kush. Yes, Aris, our captain. The other half-orc. Arian spoke more to himself than to Kush. Now that he was watching the group, he noticed an obvious resemblance between Mulak and Aris. He couldn't help but have that conversation with Kush before crossing the lower pass. They look a lot alike since they are cousins. Kush had guessed Arian's thoughts. Cousins? The young woman exclaimed. They were so different and alike at the same time. Gosberg realized that they were being watched and walked over to the magician, the Kendali, and the young woman. My dear, I am glad to see you. You are now fully recovered. I wanted to stay by your side, but Aris felt that I should continue on the road with the caravan. Don't worry, Gosberg, Kush has taken very good care of me. Don't trust that magician, he seems very serious, but be careful with him. Shut up, damn it. Just then a trumpet sounded signaling to the guests that it was time to sit down at the table, as dinner was about to begin. At the table of honor sat a representation of the mercenaries, indicating their importance to His Highness. On the right sat Kush, on the left Aris. Then the rest of the mercenaries, Agnorak, the dwarf, 3 orcs, one of them was Gulak, and a huge Denkka who sat next to Gosberg. That Denkka was a giant. He sat on the floor as there was no chair capable of supporting his weight, an impressive being, but despite his size he was well proportioned and had agile movements. Arian and the Kendali sat at the second table, presided over by Prime Minister Losgama, who sat next to them. Arian could not stop watching his savior throughout the night, who spoke animatedly with the king and Kush. None of them ate the delicacies that were served to them. They must have been dealing with very serious subjects. Aris had very elegant gestures, but his black eyes looked coldly at everything that was happening around him. Do you like it too? It was the voice of one of the princesses named Nazmarina, young and foolish. She was sitting next to Arian, and this question made her bow her head in embarrassment. Who? Arian tried to pretend to be absent-minded, but in an unconvincing way. Aris, the Black General, was the first to defeat the elves in centuries, a hero to the Dark Empire, but ended up exiled due to problems with the new emperor and became a mercenary in the company of the Blue Phoenix. It's unbelievable that you don't know him. He doesn't look like such a legendary warrior. Arian tried to justify his ignorance. That's why my father likes it. Believe me, my father has hired the best, and without a doubt they have a deserved fame. They are also quite normal, you can even talk to them. The other one isn't bad either. Who? Arian was pretending to be absent-minded. The other half-orc, much wilder and rougher, I may like better. Agnorok was a little lost at dinner. You could tell that it wasn't his environment. He was attending to the conversation with little interest since the topic they were talking about was something that didn't concern him. The half-orc saw how Arian was looking at them and lowered his gaze. The rest of the evening passed pleasantly. Arian focused on talking to Princess Nazmarina, who told him the history of her kingdom. Domemba was a small kingdom of those that emerged at the beginning of the Age of the Damned. They began to dedicate themselves to mining and agriculture. Nothing remarkable until Nazmarina's great-grandfather found a mine full of precious stones. But a problem arose. The dwarfs of the Dragon Ridge claimed the mines. As long as they only produced coal and copper, the dwarfs had not minded Domemba's exploitation. The dwarfs made a tunnel that would link Domemba's mines with their own so they could reclaim them. Thus began the first war for iron, which ironically was not for iron. The war ended with a surprising result. It ended with a victory for Domemba. His grandfather himself, with the help of a small Denka, diverted water from an underground river into the main tunnel of the mine, drowning most of the dwarven army. In fact, a statue of the two was built in the ancient capital of the kingdom to commemorate such a tremendous victory. A small Denka. But before Arian could think any more about it, dinner was over, and the king rose to say a few words. On his first attempt he did not succeed in doing so, for just before he began to speak, a loud ovation was heard, which prevented His Majesty from speaking for a few minutes. When at last the applause ceased, the king began to speak in a tone of satisfaction. Dear subjects, friends, and my beloved family, I have gathered you here to celebrate the achievement of a goal that I have longed for many years and that has finally been achieved. Again applause. The king waited for them to end in a patient manner. We've reopened the southern path, allowing us to establish a trade route with the Kingdom of Beer, and we won't have to rely on Olbiana's greedy dwarf allies anymore. More applause. A defeat of Olbiana was something that was much more celebrated by the inhabitants of Domemba. But this was not possible without the help of the mercenaries of the Blue Phoenix Company, faithful allies of ours since always, and thanks to their plan, they have eliminated all the bandits who avoided trade on the southern road. The king waved at the mercenaries sitting around him, and again a tremendous ovation arose, so much so that Aris and Kush had to rise to thank this applause, although both greeted with some reservations. Gosberg, however, greeted the respectable effusively, thanking and blowing kisses to everyone. The monarch continued with his speech. But I wouldn't be fair if I didn't also thank two ladies who took care of my delicate health and that allowed me to successfully complete this important undertaking. The king went to the table where the two young women were seated. All eyes were focused on them. Behind the king appeared two servants with two wooden boxes in their hands that they handed to the Kendali and Arian. In gratitude for your work, I give you this humble gift so that it may always enlighten you on your path. Before everyone's expectation, the two opened the box. Inside were two elven lightstones. They shone with a soft violet color. Everyone was surprised, as they were priceless. It is a small gift for your help in these difficult times. With these words the supper concluded. Arian and Vanus returned to their chambers to rest at last. The Kendali slept as always curled up, while she fiddled with the lightstone. Its operation was simple. One touch and ask for it to be turned on and the light appears. To extinguish the stone was to perform the same procedure. He was surprised that the Kendali left the stone in the box. Perhaps the Kendalis can see into the night, Arian thought. There was a knock on the door, interrupting their thoughts, but the Kendali did not wake up. Something strange about her, but they insisted again. Arian got up and opened the door. Princess Nazmarina stood before her, looking at her with a mischievous gesture. What do you want, princess? I want you to help me. Help? I'm going to try to sneak into the mercenaries' quarters to get a better look at them. Princess, don't do that. If your father finds out, he'll be angry. I don't think so, and if you're not interested, what are you going to do to avoid it? The princess let out a mocking giggle and ran away down the hallway. Arian let go of the little box that contained the lightstone and went out in search of the princess. That girl was crazy and could make a good one if she was discovered. He saw how the princess climbed a wall with some ease, and although Arian had some more difficulties, but he also ended up climbing it. When the obstacle was no longer a problem, Arian realized that he had lost track of the princess and began to search for her among the many corridors and rooms in that palace. It didn't take long for her to realize that she was the one who really had a problem because she had gotten lost in that labyrinth. The young woman was still in front of a door trying to remember how the hell she had come to that place, when she heard the sounds of footsteps and voices talking animatedly. Arian did not think twice. He opened the door and went inside the room. The young woman breathed a sigh of relief. The room was dark, but she could make out a bed at the back next to a window, that it was open and that it overlooked a huge garden. But I wasn't safe. Voices and footsteps were heading into this room. What bad luck. Arian ran to the window to get out of the room. That escape route was unfeasible. It was at a considerable height from the ground, and also the exterior wall was smooth. She had nowhere to hold on. She didn't have time either. She heard how the doorknob moved. Without thinking, she got under the bed. Hopefully it would be a soldier drunk from dinner who would fall asleep soundly and could leave the room. So he armed himself with patience, and from his position he saw a group enter and light 2 lamps. He recognized the voices participating in the conversation, the typical accent and deep tone in the voice. It was Kush the magician. Well, what did you think of the dinner? The magician asked the other interlocutor who had entered the room. Well, the king is frankly worried, isn't he? Arian felt someone throw himself heavily on top of him to rest on the bed. The other figure, who must have been Kush, took a seat in a kind of armchair that was located in front of the bed. Kush spoke again. Not to be. Albiona desires this kingdom. The evidence we have found in the bandit camp is conclusive. Albiona financed these attacks. The Jewel of the South wants the riches of Domemba, and sooner rather than later will attack to obtain them. And when that time comes, we'll be here to defend them in exchange for a juicy reward. We need to inform Dobok of the relationship between Albiona and the bandits of the Deadlands. Kush lit his pipe and started smoking. After a pause, he spoke of one last piece of news. I'll write to you tomorrow, informing you. Speaking of the fat man, we've received a letter from you. What do you want now? The other voice had a tone of complaint. Orders. We have to leave a crew of 20 men here. The rest must go back to Almera, but he wants the elite mercenaries to go through Tripulia first. Crew. The Magic Orders Council wants to hire our services. Dobok finds it interesting. The figure on the bed muttered something that wasn't hard to understand. He wasn't happy. After Dobok's reprimand, you don't think much of him. No, it's not that. I haven't been angry with him. It's that the Emperor directly threatened the entire company, one day. That day will come, don't worry. Kush tried to calm Aris. It was useless. They both knew that sooner or later he would have to face the Emperor. It wasn't Aris' fault that the last revolt on the Golden Plains, the orcs are unhappy with the new Emperor. The delegation that came to Aris for help did so in the hope that with the Black General all the orc tribes and clans would unite in the fight against the Emperor, but it was not easy since the Emperor had many allies, although they were becoming fewer and fewer. We should go to Tripulia as soon as possible, Aris. Yes, but you know how Gosberg likes to provoke mags, and the more powerful the better. They are afraid of him. none of them are quick enough to recite a spell before one of their daggers reaches them. And magicians are wary of anyone who might question their power. Do you distrust it? If the Denkga wanted us dead. Something interrupted the conversation. Arian started to get nervous. Something wasn't right. She felt someone pull her feet out of hiding. Perfume of roses, typical in the court of Domemba. Arian was white. In front of her was Aris and Kush watching her. Kush helped her up. Are you okay? Yes, thanks, I can explain. The princess wanted to sneak into the mercenaries' quarters. I went after her but got lost and ended up hiding. Don't worry, the princess is already in her chambers. It got lost and ended up on a block. Aris said with a certain amount of anger. Kush took Arian's hand and led her out of the room. They didn't talk about anything until they reached the young woman's chambers where the Kendali was waiting for her. Arian reassured Vanus, said goodbye to Kush and lay down on his bed. In the end it hadn't gone too badly. If the mercenaries headed to Tripulia, maybe she could travel with them. She smiled, luck seemed to favor her.